Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's Dialogues talk. Before I move on to welcome and introduce our speaker, it's a sincere request to keep your microphones on mute. And in case you have any questions while the talk is on, please type them out in the chat box and we will take them up at the end of today's session. Once again, welcome to today's Dialogues. And today we have with us Dr. Crispin Bates, who will be delivering the talk on Rethinking Indian Labour History, North Indian Overseas Labour Migration in the Colonial Era. Dr. Bates is Professor of Modern and Contemporary South Asian History at the University of Edinburgh and Research Professor in South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies at Sunway University in Malaysia. He completed his doctoral studies from the Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, on the social and economic history of colonial Central India. He has been a visiting professor at the University of Calcutta, at the National Museum of Ethnology in Japan, and a JSPS Research Fellow at the Institute for Oriental Culture at the University of Tokyo. His research interests lie in the social and economic history of Central India, with special emphasis on the tribals and Adivasis who live in this region. His other research interests include Orientalism and the colonial discourse, Indian labor and labor migration, and the economic and political movements in contemporary India. He has authored, co-authored, and edited a total of 15 books, including Subalterns and Raj, South Asia since 1600, and a 7-volume series titled Mutiny at the Margins, New Perspectives on the Indian Uprising of 1857. He has also been the principal investigator for an AHRC-funded project, Becoming Coolies, Rethinking the Origins of the Indian Ocean Labour Diaspora. With that, I sincerely welcome Dr. Bates and request him to begin today's talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Maithili, for that introduction. Very kind words, and I'm very glad to be with you all today. I think I'm going to begin by sharing my screen, if I may, and putting up some PowerPoint slides to go along with the talk. The title of my talk, I will begin just providing some background to what I'm going to discuss today, which concerns the AHRC Becoming Coolies project, which ran for several years at the University of Edinburgh. It involved people from India, Ashutosh Kumar particularly was our leading research fellow, Andrea Major and Marina Carter in the UK, as well as Carl Torabulli and others who contributed, many of them from around the world, to the volumes which are now coming out in a new series with Cambridge University Press called Global South Asians. There'll be 2 edited books coming out towards the end of this year, another one next year, and 2 co-authored books as well, with which I'm involved. So what I'm going to do today is just talk a little bit about the project and some of the key arguments and conclusions that came from it. The aims of the project overall were to demonstrate that South Asians have been global citizens for far longer than many of us imagine, and to show how contemporary second wave South Asian overseas migrants are not so different from those that went before. I often say that the 21st century computer programmers who are often on short-term contracts in some ways are even more disadvantaged than the plantation workers of the late 19th century. A major purpose of the project was to show was to explore examples of networks within migrant communities, both before, during, and after indenture, and to show the importance of these networks and how these networks were more important, in fact, than the demands of employers in determining the establishment and direction of different migration streams. I suppose one of the most important things we wanted to do was to challenge some of the dichotomous interpretations that dominate a lot of the literature on Indian overseas migration, arguing either that migrants were kidnapped at one extreme, or simply profit maximizing individuals at the other extreme. The reality is, of course, in all historical tales, but in particular, the stories of global migration are always far more complicated. I think one of the things we were particularly keen to do was to move away from discussions of government policies and statistics and to explore how effective interpersonal relationships could enable subaltern migrants to evade the dominant structures of colonial regimes and even to flourish within their interstices. We were also particularly keen to show how men and women exercise diverse form of agency, notwithstanding the arduous circumstances of their employment. And I suppose at the end of this, one of the big questions that does come out, of course, is the question of freedom. And I suppose all those involved in the project, challenged in some ways or other the sort of classic liberal Lockean atomistic sovereign individual subject, which is always seen in official historical and developmental discourse. Of course, none of us in reality fit that ideals. All of us are living, populate complicated social lives. And this is really what we wanted to bring forward in the studies that have been published and are being published going forward. Now, indenture migration, in case some of you do not know, was introduced in plantation colonies across the world, in the Caribbean, South Africa, Mauritius, and Fiji, to supply plantations and mines following the abolition of slavery in 1833. It's always been a controversial topic in nationalist historiography because the campaign against indenture was the very first political cause which Gandhi took up early in his career. The indenture contract, or gimmick, was a 5-year fixed-term contract, similar to the it was a fixed-term contract. Typically, actually, the period of these contracts was 3 years. It's very typical, comparable to the contracts that are still used even to this day in the military. In the Indian Army, the contracts usually go much longer, so 8, 10, 12, 15, or even 22 years. The laborers were known as girmitias, or coolies, or if they were Chinese, and there were many Chinese laborers indentured, they were known as singis. They were introduced to supply labor, as I've already said, in plantations. In the very early stages of this migration, however, there was a great many abuses, and complaints led to the suspension of the migration of Indians overseas in 1838. It was only after extensive inquiries that migration was subsequently renewed under new legislation and close supervision in 1842. There are many myths about Indian overseas migration, and I think not enough attention is paid to the continuities with the era before and the era afterwards. Migration continued to plantations in Malaysia, for example, right up into the 1950s, and migration was very common in the Indian subcontinent well before the era of colonial rule. I think one of the things that many economic historians are now beginning to realize is that the Indian village was never really self-sufficient, and that migration was always an important part of the village economy, especially in areas which were agriculturally vulnerable owing to drought or flood. One of the very typical myths is that only men were recruited overseas. And it is often said that the migrants were entirely ignorant of their destination or were even kidnapped. This is a particularly common trope, the kidnapping trope. It's not surprising in the case of women that the recruiters should be accused of kidnapping, because women were considered generally to be incapable of making autonomous decisions. Decisions about their fate could only be made by their husbands or their fathers. But there is plenty of evidence to contest the idea that the migrants were entirely ignorant about their destinations, which I will come to later. The wages and conditions of the workers varied enormously. They were appalling in the early stages, but after 1842, wages were fixed, and there was a system of protection. Inspection, where protectors would visit the ships, they would visit the depots, they would visit the plantations and the factories where laborers worked. I think one of the big problems with the literature on Indian overseas migration is it often tends to generalize about an entire century and a migration which went around the world, using only a very few limited examples, often from the commissions of inquiries in the early period. The idea that laborers were bound to work in a particular plantation, of course, was one of the aspects of indentured migration, which critics, particularly those of the Anti-Slavery Society, thought was particularly iniquitous. Employees did get a fixed wage, a place to sleep, and regular food, but the theory was that according to their contract, they could not change their employer if they wished. But in practice, huge numbers of workers were constantly being enticed through payments to work from one plantation to another. There was always a constant shortage of workers, and it was claimed that in Assam, as many as 2/3 of the workers in the plantations there had at one point or another been enticed from working in one plantation to another. This was a practice known as birding. So although the rules, yes, say that employees were fixed and had to work in one place, in practice they did move about, and often at the end of their contract would re-indenture to work somewhere else rather than return home to India. Another very common myth is that only Dangas, tribals, and Dalits or untouchables were recruited. And this is something that I will talk about later on with some statistical evidence. This was one of the reasons given in the early stages to justify the migration. In debates in the British Parliament, the planters said, you don't need to worry, we'll only be taking the lowest of the low, the most unskilled sections of Indian society to work overseas. This was in order to placate opposition from many of officials in the Indian government who saw overseas migration as a loss of a valuable resource, that is, cheap labor. But the reality is that even though Adivasis were prominent in amongst the earliest recruits for shipment overseas, very soon other sections of society became involved, as I will demonstrate later on. Another generalization that is often made is that British agents did most of the recruiting. It was very soon found that they were not reliable and they were not effective, and the vast majority of the migration overseas was in fact managed by Indian intermediaries of one sort or another. The final point generalization which I would like to take issue is the idea that in the colonial period, most overseas migrants were indentured. The reality is that millions of Indians traveled overseas. Sunil Amrit has estimated that as many as 23 million crossed the Bay of Bengal alone during the colonial era. The number of those who were indentured were probably no more than about 3 million. Figures vary between 1.5, 2, and 3 million. But many more migrated as their own volition without having signed in advance a contract in order to find out what the best opportunities were once they were stayed there, once they had arrived there. And most, though, did not remain. 2/3 of all indentured migrants went back to India. Only 1/3 remained, and that is why the figures that we see of Indians abroad today are perhaps not representative of the scale of migration that went on. There was a lot of movement backwards and forwards between the Indian, particularly around the Indian Ocean, which we're only beginning now to get some sense of. So you maybe wonder, well, if that is true, why is so much written about indentured migration? And the reason is because indentured migration was regulated by the state. If you go, therefore, or into any archive you will of the colonial period, where you found mountains of documents relating to indentured migration. The other migration streams are not covered at all. And historians acted. Okay, so what about the early history of migration? Well, we can trace the culture of migration in North India back to the beginnings of the Delhi Sultanate. Typically, it came from fertile but flood-prone areas, such as in East UP and Bihar. And the frequency of this migration is evident in the poetry and folklore of the region. The widespread motif being one of separation, especially the separation between a traveling husband and his wife. Dirk Kolff, in his book Nowkar, Rajput and Sepoy, describes the important role of migrants from Bihar in East UP as sepoys, both in the Mughal army and the East India Company's Bengal army. And those same areas which sent recruits to the army were also amongst the first to send recruits to work in plantations overseas. Reports by Pitcher and Grierson in 1883 show that by the 1880s, at least, the merits and demerits of various overseas destinations were well known. For example, in UP, Pitcher noted that Trinidad, popularly known as Chinitat, was preferred to Demerara, popularly known as Dumra or Dumraila. Jamaica was considered a good destination, but little was known of Fiji or Natal, probably due to the late beginning of emigration to Fiji in 1879, and the fact that most of the laborers going to Natal in South India came from South India. Mauritius, properly known as Mirich, was less popular by the 1880s, probably owing to a decline in wages there compared with the 1860s, which were the boom years for the Mauritian sugar trade. So this is a rough map showing where they went and some of the numbers. By the end of so we have this, it is from this that we derive a total of something like 2 million overseas migrants in indentured contracts. But the numbers of actual people traveling to Southeast Asia were far, far greater than these raw figures will indicate. This statistic, these graphs, this map incidentally comes from David Northrup's study on indentured labor. This is the type of territory that met the earliest migrants. The activity in which most of the first migrants were involved was clearing the forest. And this was extremely hazardous. There were obviously very unhealthy living conditions, and the forests, particularly those in Assam, were malarious. Mauritius, fortunately, was malaria-free until the later 19th century, but in Assam was certainly, and Malaysia were extremely hazardous environments in which to work. This was a drawing from 1812 of Mauritius. This is a drawing of a coolie hut in Mauritius from the early 19th century. And this is from the 1860s, an Indian settlement. And you can see once lands had been cleared, once land had been brought under cultivation, once the settled population had begun to grow, so you begin to get a development of a more sophisticated standard of living. In the wake of the laborers, of course, there came merchants, and very soon Indian settlements also had shops, and indentured workers themselves, after they had served out their contracts, would often take to trade in the locality where they lived. And of course, over time, those wooden buildings begin to be made of concrete, of brick and tile. And this is a street scene from Kandy in Ceylon in 1895. Now, the uprising of 1857 had an enormous impact on the migration overseas. I've already mentioned that the indentured migrants were only a small proportion of the total number of Indians traveling abroad in the colonial era. And it is true that the earliest migrants were often described by officials and and planters as Dangas, and they included Kold, Santals, Orangs, and Mundus, particularly from Chota Nagpur. However, after 1857, there appears to be a big change, which we see in the records of the migrants who are recruited in the ship's lists. This is the total number of migrants from Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta between 1857 and 1865. And you can see that in the immediate aftermath, there's a big increase in the number of migrants overseas, particularly from Calcutta. This analysis is based on a sample of 4,600 migrants who left from Calcutta between 1857 and 1869 to Guyana, South Africa, Trinidad, and Mauritius. And you can see from this graph that the migrants who were recruited very largely came from, or concentrated very much from, the regions in Bihar and East UP, where the uprising had been most fiercely fought from village to village in 1857, and the very same areas were in fact from where many of the mutinous Bengal army sepoys were recruited. That graph looks much easier to understand if you look at it on a map. And as you can see here, these are all particularly areas, the darkest areas, where those were at the heart of the uprising of 1857 and the heart of the area where Bengal sepoys were recruited. The most interesting thing about these migrants, though, is their social status. If we broke down the 4,600 migrants from Calcutta to Trinidad, Guyana, Mauritius, and South Africa into 7 broad groups: Brahmins and Kshatriyas, Vaishya and artisans, middling castes, Muslims, Dalit and backward castes, Adivasis and others. And the amazing thing is, if you look at the Bengal, or the census for Bengal and the Northwest provinces in 1881, the division, the population of this region was almost identical on the boats as in the census returns. So in other words, in the period between, although it may be that Adivasis were preferred in early years, after 1857, overseas migration from Calcutta attracts people from all sections of society, from which we can conclude that the uprising, the social and economic living conditions affected, poor conditions in the aftermath of 1857 affected everybody equally, and therefore all sections of society can be found amongst the migrants. And I think these statistics are even more interesting when we bear in mind that the recruiters were trying not to recruit high caste Brahmins because they were considered unsuited. So the figures here, if anything, probably seriously underestimates the number of Brahmins who were on the boats. Okay, so how did these migrants move overseas? Well, in the past, as in the present, they were recruited by intermediaries of various sorts, those heading to Sri Lanka or to from South India, or going from South India to Malaysia or Myanmar were recruited by so-called Kanganis. Those recruited going to Assam were recruited by Arkatis. Those going to from North India to Mauritius, South Africa, or the Caribbean were recruited by Sirdars. They're all names, different names for essentially the same function. They are intermediaries who recruit people, bring them to the coast, and then accompany them on their journey overseas, and ultimately become their overseers. In the case of Sardars going to Mauritius, the migrants are usually an advance is given by the plantation owner, and they are all on contracts of indenture. Migrants going to Sri Lanka or to Southeast Asia were not indentured in most cases. In the vast majority of them, if they borrowed money from the recruiter, but not from the plantation owner. Migrants maintained close contact with home, and they informed each other of pitfalls and opportunities along the way. And many, we have statistics on this, were re-indentured in other colonies after their contracts had expired. Old migrants were those who became returnee recruiters, and ultimately also served as the overseers and competed with each other for the best wages from plantation owners. Women migrants were conspicuous in the migrant flow. From 1842 onwards, regulations demanded that 40% of migrants should be women. This figure was not achieved, but there were serious attempts to do so. Many women who traveled alone did so due to a combination of circumstances, such as early widowhood, or because they had relatives who were unable or unwilling to support them. It must be remembered that most marriages were contracted in childhood. So the chances of a woman becoming a widow and unable to remarry subsequently could happen in their early teens. This is why there were one reason why many women were keen to migrate overseas and to make new lives for themselves. Some also indentured to elope or to avoid marriage, or to escape from abusive husbands, as in the case of Singaria, a migrant to Assam, whose fortunes I followed in a publication a few years ago. Whilst fraud was evident in some cases, the thing that we tried to bring out in our research is that women were not, for the most part, passive victims, and a few even became recruiters themselves. Women played a vital role in supporting underpaid laboring sons and husbands, and were often successful in establishing independent economic niches in colonial states. They also helped to recreate religious and cultural traditions overseas. And those who were left behind endeavored to maintain links with migrant families. And there, in several archives, particularly in Fiji and in Mauritius, we have quite substantial collections of letters which were not delivered to their destination, which in both directions. And these letters which failed to be delivered for one reason or another reveal the connections between the villages from where the migrants came, and the attempts to reunify families. A lot of migrants, after they served out their colonies, would go back to India. One of their first objectives was often to recruit their family members to return with them. So communication was very important. Through hard labor, inheritance, and entrepreneurship, many Indian women became substantial property owners and used their wealth to set up community organizations, found religious institutions, and family businesses. Most businesses carry the names of their husbands. This is very common throughout the Indian Ocean region, but it's very often common the case that they were set up or first started by the women whilst their husbands were laboring in the cane fields. And women could even become sirdars or overseers, such as Sukonia, who was in charge of 16 men on the Clemencia estate in Mauritius in the 1870s. These intermediaries who did the recruiting, known as sardars or kanganis or maestries, were absolutely vital to carrying on overseas migration. It wouldn't have happened without them. But nonetheless, they're frequently described as parasitic middlemen, and rather like the traffickers of today, they are despised and looked down on, and they were reviled by sugar and rubber planters and a common cause of complaint. But they're also, I would argue, evidence of very important levels of informal social organization within the economy. And just the same can be said of traffickers. They are actually helping people to get from A to B in breach of laws which forbid them to travel. For this reason, obviously, governments dislike them. but they are supplying an absolutely necessary service in the case of refugees from violence or poverty. In Assam, the Akatis, who were the typical names for the recruiters, received an especially bad press. They were called the scum of the country, ex-convicts, burglars, thieves, dacoits, and notorious badmashes. Dafadars and other intermediaries were similarly described, but other sources describe them as belonging to the very class of people who migrate as laborers and live and move among them. And indeed, it was the case that all of the, from the 1890s onwards, all of the indentured laborers were recruited for Assam were recruited by ex-indentured laborers because they were considered to be the most effective at this task. In the case of Mauritius, it was said, and this is that every migrant actually arrives amongst a gang of workers under the control of a Sardar. And this is actually one of my favorite quotes, this one here, because it describes very well the contrast between the imaginary of the planter, of how the economic system should function, with the individuals presenting themselves for employment, and the reality, which of course is different. The quotation runs, "No immigrant ever forms an engagement for himself or even communicates with the planter who is standing before him for the purpose of obtaining his services. They invariably and implicitly follow the will and directions of the Sirdar to whom they have given their confidence." And this, of course, there are many negative reasons given by the planters for this. They would prefer that there was no organization amongst the workers, that they could deal with them as individuals. But the reality is the workers preferred to work in a collectivity, ideally of people from a similar background, similar origins, under the leadership of a Sirdar who they knew and trusted. The 1875 Royal Commission appointed to inquire into the treatment of immigrants in the Mauritius concluded patronizingly, notwithstanding that the many objections that there are, both theoretically and in practice, to the Sirdar system, it is one so entirely consonant with the habits and customs of the natives of India that we fear there will be great difficulty in breaking through it. The reality, of course, is that the planters themselves also depended absolutely on Indian intermediaries to perform the role of recruiting and organizing the labor. It just went against some imaginary working of the ideal competitive labor market that they thought they should aspire to. But the reality was always going to be more complicated, both for employer and employee. Same arrangements applied in migrants headed to Sri Lanka or to Malaysia or Myanmar. The recruit in this case was called the Kangani. And according to R.K. Jain, who did a very excellent field work amongst in the 1960s and 70s in Malaysia, each Kangani recruited a score or more of men belonging mainly to his own caste and kin group. And from about the turn of the century, emigration by families was the predominant form. Sometimes several emigrant bands, each under its own leader, combined under the overall direction of a high caste Kangani. The relations between a Kangani and a laborer could be likened to that of a patron and his client. Now, this kind of organization of the workers applied not only in migration overseas, but also migration from within rural India and between rural India and the cities. It, in fact, was a continuation of a very effective informal method of social organization within the labor market. Here is a photograph of a group of Calcutta coolies. And here are some comments about the role of Sardars or overseers in the Calcutta jute mills. Dipesh Chakrabarti argued that they played a vital role in recruiting and controlling the workforce, although he characterized it not as a necessity, but as a pre-capitalist culture. which is something I would take issue with, since we find the same thing today in many societies. In fact, I would say every society, without exception. Shuba Basu criticized the notion that workers were entirely in the grip of conservative sirdars. He argued that many of them were, in fact, very ardent in advancing the interests of the workers. Tirthankar Roy argued that the agents, again, had roots in the traditional economy and represented an incorporation of putting out and the authority of the headman inside modern work sites. He argued that this gave rise to coherent contradictions. I would say it was entirely the opposite. In most cases, it was a source of strength and resilience for the workers, where otherwise the commanding the power was entirely in the hands of employers. Rajnarayan Chandravarkar argued that by the 1920s in Mumbai, the role of the Sirdar was all but dead. I think there's lots of evidence to the contrary, but he believed that the rise of trade unions tended to supplant them and make them no longer necessary or necessary. But he, at the same time, he argued against, linearity and one-dimensional assumptions about the industrialization of pre-industrial societies. And I think there is also a lacuna in the understanding of industrialized societies as well, in terms of the role of intermediaries. Aryan Dahan wrote that in jute mills and other industries of Calcutta, the process of recruitment has been predominantly personalistic. Recruitment was and still is mainly through personal relations. Now, if that is still important today, it is not surprising that we find plenty of evidence of it in the past. Intermediaries who were recruiters are not so different than people who were described as contractors. The difference is that contractors were often dealing in larger sums of money and for more important employers. That is how they get a more positive reputation. One of the more interesting contractors who I came across was a man called Akbar Shah, a Pathan, who in the 1890s recruited 200 Afridis and Pathans to undertake contract work, first in Punjab and then on the Assam-Bengal Railway. He then moved with them to Yangon in Burma, where his men worked in quarries, providing stone for the reconstruction of the docks. Within 3 years, he'd muscled out his two rivals and became the sole contractor with 700 to 800 laborers in his pay. He was described at this time as the largest labor contractor in the British Empire by one official in Yangon. His brother, Ajab Gul, then took a party of 200 Pathans to Sri Lanka to undertake work on a railway station extension in Ratnapura. Things were going very well for him, unfortunately, until 1915, when Akbar Shah came to official notice, being suspected of having helped to incite a Punjab regiment in Singapore to mutiny. In 1915, there were also anti-Muslim riots in Sri Lanka. When Akbar Shah arrived there, he was suspected of conspiring to incite further disturbances, and he was thus arrested and deported to Yangon. Soon after, his brother too was arrested and sent to India, where he was imprisoned by the Madras authorities, and the laborers repatriated to the northwest provinces. So that is how we came to know of his career, because he fell foul of the intelligence services during the First World War. Simply, I suspect, because he was related to the same individuals who were involved in the Singapore mutiny. But his story, his arc, I think is not untypical of that of many who began as small recruiters and gradually got ambitious and took larger and larger groups of workers to South Africa or East Africa or Myanmar or elsewhere. They're just these contractors, though, are not documented and described in detail in the Colonial Archive because the workers weren't indentured. So the British had no formal responsibility for overseeing their recruitment and their employment. So we have to find out the information about them through indirect means, and it's much harder to find. Trust was essential to it is essential to all long-distance migration, and it was also the case in the migration of Indian overseas. Trust was maintained through intermediaries of various sorts, but also religious authorities, caste councils, and kith and kin networks. The government also tried to engender trust by encouraging the belief that migrants were working for the Sarkar or the company. And the use of forward. Dual language permits also were provided to make sure that that those who were recruited could understand very well what they were undertaking to do. The contracts were often published in 3 languages so that the details could be understood, and migrants had to present themselves before a magistrate to confirm that they had understood the terms and conditions and that they knew what they were contracting to do. Groups of labourers as well as individuals signed work contracts which travelled with them overseas, and this is proof of the fact that people were working, were travelling together as parties and not as individuals, even though they were supposed to be recruited as individuals. This was not practically the way that the system worked. They also trust was also important in the recruitment process. Those who were sent home to recruit workers often carried letters with them. This is a typical example. Dear sirs, the bearer of this Dibideen is a man of good character who returns to his native country with a sum of money, his intention being to come back to Mauritius. We authorize you to pay him the cost of his passage as well as to any able-bodied men who may wish to accompany him. So this was sent to an agent in the depot who was responsible for dispersing funds to the recruiter. The depot itself was a very important site. People would sometimes have to wait for weeks there until an appropriate ship could arrive to carry them to their destination. This is where information was often exchanged, and sirdars or gang leaders selected by those who had arrived on their own rather than in group in Calcutta. The sirdars played a very important role once they arrived at their destination, often acting as a form of saving bank. They could retain a portion of the monthly wages of the labourers, which would then be returned when they wished to send money home, or if they became ill and their pay was docked. The sirdar would also lend money at a price for special purposes such as marriages. The most interesting thing that they did was often to pool wages and then divide and redistribute it. In Mauritius, this had a particular purpose, which was to render ineffective the punitive wage deductions that might be levied by the planter. So for example, if someone was off sick, they had not announced in advance that they were taking the day off work or intended the day off for work, they would be deducted 2 days' wages in Mauritius. And by pooling the wages and dividing them up, the sirdar could basically become the last resort of every worker who could depend upon him to protect their interests and to ensure that they were paid even if they were unwell. This practice was observed by the owner of the La Barak plantation in Grand Port, who found that the sirdars had stopped the wages of their bands and were putting them all together in one bag. He was convinced that they were doing this for some unfair reason, and he forbade the practice. But this, I think, demonstrates that this was commonplace. These financial arrangements between sirdars and their labourers strengthened the bond between them and was often a source of tension between the sirdars and the planters, because they could use their hold over the workers to negotiate better wages if they re-indentured. It was observed in 1865 by one official that the competition now existing between the planter and the job contractor, who is generally some old sirdar who has acquired influence over his comrades, is now altogether in favor of the latter, who is always able to offer higher wages, exemption from discipline, and continual leave of absence with the same guarantee to the laborer for the payment of his wages. So this was the role that the crucial role that sirdar could often make, was getting people re-employed with better wages and conditions than they had done before. So why are they so notorious? Well, intermediaries like traffickers in the present day breach national boundaries and defy territorial ideas of citizenship. They serve both employers and the laborers. So both employers and laborers at times might suspect their motives and question their loyalties. They inhabit, above all, the world of the informal economy, so it is not generally subject to any form of government regulation. The only times we do get to hear about sirdars and other intermediaries is when things go wrong and the informal methods of arbitration have failed, and their disputes come before the law courts in colonial destinations. And that means almost every story we have from the sirdars is from legal cases in which they are presented as the evildoer, although it's not always the case. For example, there was one marvelous story in the Mauritius archives about a sirdar lending the wages of the workers to the plantation owner who was in debt. And when the plantation owner failed to pay the money back, he then took the plantation owner to court. Successfully, he won the case, although sadly he did not get the money back. The Commission on Mauritius Labour of 1875 has lots of negative things to say about the sirdars. I think one of the most interesting comments was by Mr. Martin, which was that the sirdar does not make the men work as well and properly as they might, which again rings a bell. You know, this is the type of thing of which trade unionists are also sometimes accused. Of course, they encourage all sorts of bad behavior on the part of the workers, and allegedly also enslaved them by means of loans and advances. But this enslavement would often be a willing relationship, a bit of bondage from the worker to the sirdar, because through debt, social relationships are strengthened and embodied. So debt relations are more than just financial transactions in most economies. Alongside all of the abuses, list of abuses, there were also instances of planters finding sirdars to be intelligent and useful, such as Mr. Antelme. But I think one of the things that we should do is question, when we're looking at colonial sources, the use of this term abuse. Because when a colonial official or a planter talks about abuses, what they are doing in reality is describing instances in which Indians have made money at their expense. This is particularly the case in recruitment to Assam. It was described as incredibly corrupt because intermediaries took so many cuts along the way that it was said to be 4 times more expensive to recruit a worker to Assam than it was to Mauritius, because so many intermediaries were involved. But what that practically meant was that a lot of ex-workers, former workers, and friends of workers were making money out of the business of recruitment at the expense of the planters. So from their point of view, it was nothing but a good thing. Which brings me to the conclusions of what my presentation today, which is that I would argue, it is fairly obvious from what I'm saying, that contrary to the mythology of the kind of the Indian village republic and of Indians being of South Asia being a very stable and conservative society, there is in fact a long history of migration in North India and elsewhere, and I've written about this in various publications, despite, as have many others. Despite the assertions of colonial officials, there was substantial evidence that high caste and skilled laborers were recruited for indentured migration overseas, and many indeed in the late 1850s and 1860s from UP and Bihar were probably former rebellious army sepoys. Workers commonly moved from one category of labor to another. So, for example, the presence of ex-sepoys in the sugar colonies from Guyana to Fiji was often used by newspaper columnists to explain strikes and other militant actions amongst the sugarcane workers. Women also played an important role in overseas labor migration. They were not allowed to work in the fields, the sugarcane fields in every destination, but that did not mean that they did not play a very important economic function. And of course, they totally controlled certain niches within the economy. Particularly in the Assam, where they became the sole responsibility of tea picking. The general argument that I think we're trying to make in our research is that pyramids of informal, affective networks of trust are crucial in all economic relationships and are often more harmonious and effective than official archives and literature might suggest, because the only time when we get to hear about these relationships is when they have gone seriously wrong and a court case has resulted. Overall, intermediaries were crucial in providing information, mediation, and establishing trust in contractual and informal relationships. And I think a failure to recognize this in the economic history of South Asia suggests an important need for us to decolonize our historical and sociological thought, to take out the Adam Smith, the dreams of 19th century British traders, and to put back the laborers themselves and their voices and the lives that they actually fashion for themselves in their migratory lives. But I suppose the final remark that I want to make is that there has been a major revolution in the history of migration to Australia, reappraising the background and origins of convict workers in Australia. It often used to be said that convicts, the bulk of the Australian population mainly came from the criminal classes of the United Kingdom, that they were ill-educated and unskilled. New research has proved this to be far from true. And it was the same also with indentured migration of Indians overseas. They did not come from some underclass. They were not unskilled. They, in fact, came from all sections of society and contributed enormously to the development of the global South, in a far greater scale than, in fact, is evident to us from the raw statistics of colonial administration. Okay, that's it. That's me finished. And I'd love to hear some questions from you.